The camera moved across the studio, capturing the glowing lights and the packed crowd. It was prime-time national spotlight was airing live across America. People from both sides of the political line sat shoulder to shoulder, waiting to witness a conversation that had already drawn massive attention. At center stage stood Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in modern history. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were sharp. She wore a navy blazer with the White House pin shining on her lapel. Next to her was Jeff Bezos, the billionaire behind Amazon, dressed in a classic gray suit and open-collar shirt. He looked confident, ready to talk about the future of global economics and technology. The host, a seasoned journalist named Brian Ward, stepped forward and smiled at the camera. "Good evening, America. Tonight we bring together two titans, one from the world of politics, the other from the empire of tech. It's going to be a powerful night." Applause filled the room, though it quickly faded into silence as Brian turned to Karoline. "Madam Secretary, you've spoken out about corporate ethics in the past. Tonight, with Mr. Bezos here, do you still believe companies like Amazon need to be held more accountable?" Karoline didn't blink. She turned slowly to face the audience, her voice clear but steady. "Accountability isn't optional when your decisions affect millions of lives," she began. "This isn't about profit margins or tech innovation. It's about how power is used and sometimes abused behind the scenes." Bezos gave a polite nod, his expression unchanged. The crowd watched, unsure of what was coming next. Karoline continued, "You see, when a company has the kind of reach Amazon does, it's with influence in everything from home deliveries to cloud computing for federal agencies, the line between business and policy gets blurry." Bezos leaned forward. Slightly. He knew how to handle pressure. But Karoline wasn't finished. "Especially," she said slowly, "when offshore favors start to mix with public decisions." A beat passed. The room seemed to hold its breath. Brian raised an eyebrow. "Offshore favors. Would you care to elaborate?" Karoline smiled faintly. "Not yet. But I will say this: corporate empires don't always operate in plain sight. Sometimes they work through proxies. People who aren't on the company's payroll, but whose influence is far more powerful." Bezos shifted in his seat. For the first time, his jaw tightened. Karoline turned toward him now, the spotlight catching the edge of her voice. "There are names," she said, "that appear more often in certain reports than others. Names like Lauren Sánchez." A murmur rose from the audience. The mention was sudden but deliberate. No one expected that. Bezos looked directly at Karoline now, his face unreadable. "Lauren is not part of Amazon's executive structure." Any suggestion that Karoline interrupted softly. "No one said she was." But influence doesn't always require a title. Sometimes all it takes is access. It's the right call at the right time. The host tried to intervene, but the air had already changed. Bezos cleared his throat. "Let's stick to verified facts. Speculation can ruin reputations." Karoline nodded. "Absolutely. And that's why I believe in full transparency. For corporations, for politicians, and yes, even for their closest advisors." A subtle gasp came from a corner of the room. It wasn't the words, but the tone behind them that made the moment so intense. Karoline wasn't just stating an opinion. She was suggesting something more. Online, the clip was already trending. Social media erupted. Hashtag National Spotlight and hashtag LeavittVs, BEZ/ climbed the charts within minutes. Brian tried to steer the conversation. "Back, Mr. Bezos. Would you like to respond directly?" Bezos folded his hands together. "Look, I'm here to talk about innovation, about what Amazon does for the global economy. We employ over 1 million people. We help small businesses. That's the real story." Karoline looked directly into the camera now. "And I'm here to make sure the American people know when that story becomes fiction." Another pause. The atmosphere was electric. Brian stepped in again, sensing the rising stakes. Let's keep this civil, please. Karoline, are you accusing Mr. Bezos or Ms. Sánchez of wrongdoing? Karoline exhaled. Not accusing. Not yet. But I'm asking questions. Questions that matter when we're talking about billion-dollar deals and decisions that impact federal policy. If some of those decisions were shaped outside the official room, I think the public has a right to know. Bezos didn't speak this time. His lips pressed together. His hands gripped the edge of his chair. The lights overhead shifted slightly as the camera zoomed in closer on his face. The billionaire who built an empire on controlling systems now found himself cornered by a young press secretary who clearly wasn't playing safe. The studio. Lights returned from commercial, but the atmosphere was no longer the same. The earlier excitement had shifted into something sharper, tense, unpredictable. Viewers at home felt it through their screens. Inside the studio, it was even heavier. The silence after Karoline Leavitt's last comment about Lauren Sánchez hung in the air like smoke. Jeff Bezos adjusted his posture, smoothing the front of his suit as if to regain control. The host, Brian Ward, cleared his throat and tried to return to the original script. Mr. Bezos, perhaps we can move to the topic of corporate responsibility. There's been ongoing criticism that Amazon's international partnerships blur the line between innovation and monopoly. How do you respond to that? Bezos answered smoothly, his voice calm. Amazon operates in over a dozen countries. We comply with every local regulation. And we create jobs, not just tech jobs, but warehouse jobs, delivery, logistics. Without Amazon, millions of small businesses wouldn't even exist today. Karoline tilted her head, waiting. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak fully. It was clear she had a strategy, Bezos went on. We've also launched programs focused on sustainability, employee education, and digital training. That's more than most companies can say. Brian turned to Karoline. Madam Secretary, do you agree with those claims? She didn't look at Brian. Her eyes were fixed on Bezos. No corporation becomes that big without building escape. Roots, she said plainly. You speak about regulations. What about the offshore subsidiaries? What about the procurement contracts tied to political appointments? And the real question, who's making those introductions? Bezos raised a brow, his expression cool. If you're suggesting we've done something illegal, I suggest you provide proof. I'm suggesting, Karoline replied, her tone sharp, that some people sitting in that chair before you did not anticipate that this administration would be asking those very questions. Brian's face tightened. Karoline, you're implying very serious allegations. Do you have any basis for this? She reached to her side and picked up a thin manila folder, lightly placing it on her lap. She didn't open it. She didn't need to, not yet. There's been a series of contracts signed over the past 5 years, logistics contracts, tied to federal emergency response plans. One of them includes a transportation agreement signed during the pandemic. The public never saw the names on those documents, but I have. Bezos didn't move. He stared at her, but his smile had vanished. Karoline continued, her voice even. And while Amazon wasn't directly listed, a consulting firm tied to Lauren Sanchez's aviation company was 3 weeks before she entered a relationship with you. The silence that followed was colder than before. Brian glanced nervously between them. You're saying Ms. Sánchez received contracts through influence? Karoline responded without blinking. I'm saying certain private companies were awarded access that bypassed the normal bidding process. And one of those companies had a silent partner listed under a shell corporation in Delaware. A few audience members gasped audibly. Bezos finally spoke, his tone controlled but firm. Shell companies are legal, and aviation firms had roles to play during the crisis. You're connecting dots that don't belong together. Then you won't mind if we release the contract list and let the public decide, Karoline said. Bezos narrowed his eyes. That happens It'll show you nothing but standard procedure. Caroline's voice dropped just slightly, enough that the microphone barely caught it. That's exactly what people say before the subpoenas start. Oh, a wave of whispers rippled through the studio. Online, the clip was already being clipped, subtitled and dissected by political influencers on both sides. The hashtag Leavitt, Bezos, trended globally. Comments flooded in, some furious, others exhilarated. The debate had turned into a full-blown political event. Brian tried again to regain control. This interview was meant to be a policy discussion. I don't think any of us expected this to escalate into Karoline. Cut him off, gently. The American people didn't expect billionaires to get backdoor access to federal contracts either. Bezos sat quietly, calculating. His empire had weathered criticism before, but never like this. Never so publicly. Never with someone willing to weaponize the fine print. The show was live, but neither guest was sticking to the script anymore. The stage lights dimmed again as the next segment loomed. But in that brief pause, it was clear. Something had shifted. Not just in the room, but in the national conversation. Whatever Karoline had in that folder, it wasn't just a political tool. It was a threat, and Bezos knew it. The camera returned after a short break, and the room buzzed with low murmurs. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens. Inside the studio, the air felt dense, like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. Karoline Leavitt sat motionless, her fingertips resting lightly on the manila folder in her lap. She hadn't opened it yet, but its very presence was enough to shift the power dynamic. Jeff Bezos, meanwhile, had adjusted his tie twice in 30 seconds, a rare sign of discomfort from the usually unshakable tech titan. The host, Brian Ward, tried to regain control. "Let's take this back to a constructive place," he said, smiling nervously. "We still have to discuss technology's role in national security and corporate ethics. Mr. Bezos, let's start with you." Bezos leaned forward, voice steady but colder now. "Amazon works closely with federal and state agencies on logistics, cybersecurity, and data services. We've supported defense systems, emergency responses, and intelligence tools because we believe in protecting America's future." Karoline glanced sideways, just slightly. Her expression didn't change. Brian continued. "Madam Secretary, how do you view Amazon's role in national security?" Karoline didn't hesitate. "Any private corporation embedded in defense contracts, surveillance tools, or AI development should be held to the same level of scrutiny as a public institution. The moment profit mixes with national security, the lines blur." Bezos exhaled quietly but didn't interrupt. She leaned forward now, her voice cool and calm. "Amazon's influence isn't just about efficiency, it's about access. It's access to sensitive data, decision makers, even infrastructure." The audience was silent again. Then Karoline finally opened the folder. Slowly, she pulled out a single printed email header, visible even from the audience's distance. The subject line read, "Pre-clearance, Private Carrier Contract Pandemic. Response 2020." Karoline held it up, just enough for the camera to zoom in. "This," she said, "is one of several emails between a now-defunct private consulting firm and a senior logistics advisor within FEMA. The consulting firm's representative is the same man who later joined Ms. Sanchez's aviation company as director of expansion." Bezos's jaw tightened. He said nothing. Karoline placed the email on the desk, then produced a second document, this time a payment transfer receipt. "This shows a payment made to a third-party LLC weeks before the contract was signed. That LLC is registered in Delaware, and its listed mailing address matches one used by a private jet hangar currently operated by Ms. Sanchez's firm." Brian leaned forward. "Are you directly accusing Mr. Bezos of influencing government contracts through his partner's business?" Karoline's reply was clear. I'm not accusing, okay? I'm asking why these details have never been explained, okay? Why this entire paper trail has never been audited. And why people like Mr. Bezos get called visionaries instead of witnesses. Bezos finally spoke again. With respect, he said, voice lower, firmer. These documents don't prove anything. I've never interfered with Lauren's business. I've never spoken to anyone at FEMA. You're spinning this into a conspiracy. Karoline didn't flinch. Then you'll support a full congressional inquiry. That was the moment the room stopped breathing. Bezos blinked once. If it clears my name, absolutely. Karoline nodded slowly. Good, because a request has already been filed. Gasps spread through the audience. Brian looked as if he'd just swallowed a lemon. Karoline reached under the folder and held up a sealed envelope. Delivered to the House Oversight Committee this morning. Online, the clip was already viral. Thousands were tweeting phrases like, "She played the long game, and this is more than a debate. It's an expose." Brian, struggling to move forward, cleared his throat. We'll be taking one final segment on future corporate regulation after the break. But the moment had already passed. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power, okay? And the public had seen it all unfold in real dash time as the cameras pulled away. Bezos sat rigid, blinking at the lights. His empire, long insulated from public accountability, was now the center of the firestorm. And Karoline Leavitt. She sat calm, composed, and quietly victorious. She hadn't raised her voice once, but she didn't need to. The commercial break ended. But the atmosphere in the studio had not cooled. If anything, it was sharper, tighter, like a piano wire pulled. Too far, the audience had returned to their seats, yet no one spoke. Online, the moment Karoline held up that sealed envelope had been clipped, reposted, and dissected by millions. Hashtags like Sánchez Gate and hashtag Leavitt Files were now trending. Worldwide, Brian Ward, the host, shuffled his notes nervously as the lights returned full strength. Welcome back to National Spotlight, where tonight's conversation between Karoline Leavitt and Jeff Bezos has taken an unexpected and intense turn. He turned toward Bezos, whose posture remained straight but tense, jaw locked in restraint. "Mr. Bezos," Brian said cautiously, "you mentioned you were open to a congressional inquiry. Now that Ms. Leavitt has confirmed one is underway, would you like to respond?" Bezos inhaled deeply, then leaned forward. "I stand by what I said. I welcome transparency, have nothing to hide. But I do find it disturbing that a White House official is using national television to accuse a private citizen. My partner included of corruption based on circumstantial links and corporate paperwork." Karoline didn't even blink. Bezos continued, "This is not a court. This is a public spectacle. And what's being done here is weaponizing optics. Connecting dots that don't touch just to stir public outrage." Karoline responded without raising her voice. "What Mr. Bezos calls optics, I call patterns. And when patterns repeat across finances, contracts, and silent partnerships, the people have a right to ask why." The host tried to cut in. "Let's not lose sight of the larger topic: technology and public accountability." Karoline nodded but didn't look away from Bezos. "Exactly. And that's what this is about. Technology is not neutral anymore. It's not just code and commerce. It's access. It's factional power. It's about who has the ability to bypass rules because of proximity to money, to politics, or to someone like Lauren Sánchez." At that moment, a new photo appeared on the screen behind them, one not yet seen by the public. It was a blurry shot of a quiet tarmac, a small group of people near a private jet. One of them unmistakably Jeff Bezos. Another, a man previously identified in the consulting firm's email thread. The third face turned bore a strong resemblance to Sánchez. Gasps rippled through the room. Karoline turned slightly toward the screen. taken 3 days before the FEMA contract was finalized. No logs, no public record of the meeting. But the plane belongs to Horizon Air Holdings, which Ms. Sanchez's firm acquired partial stake in last year. Bezos didn't speak immediately. His eyes narrowed. "That photo proves nothing," he said eventually. "And if that's where this debate is head, innuendo and backroom snapshots, I won't be a part of it." He started to rise, but Brian Ward raised a hand. "Mr. Bezos, I think it's important you clarify, was this meeting government-related?" Bezos stayed standing. "No, that was a routine logistics discussion about pandemic response cargo routes. The others involved were business partners, not federal employees. And Lauren didn't participate in any contract discussions. She was there for personal reasons." Karoline tilted her head slightly. "Then surely the logs and communications from that meeting can be released." "I've got nothing to hide," Bezos replied, voice now harder. Karoline nodded once. "Then the Oversight Committee will expect full cooperation." The air in the room felt electric, like everyone was waiting for a lightning strike. Brian tried again to shift the energy. "Let's hear from some members of the audience." He stood and walked to a woman in a blue blazer. She held a microphone tightly. "I'm a small business owner. I watched my supply contracts disappear during COVID while Amazon expanded. So yes, I want to know if the game was rigged." Applause. Another audience member, an older man in a veteran's cap, added, "We're not against innovation. We're against the elite rewriting the rules behind closed doors." Bezos returned to his seat, his eyes scanning the crowd. No trace of his usual control remained. The audience, once split, now tilted heavily toward Karoline. Brian finally said, "We'll go to closing statements in our next segment, but clearly this conversation is far from over." The camera panned out slowly. Karoline folded the folder shut, still calm, still collected. Jeff Bezos stared ahead, jaw tight, hands clenched. It was clear now this wasn't just about business. It was about trust, and who still had the people's ear. The final segment of the night was meant to be closing statements. Instead, it felt more like a prelude to something much larger, something no one in that room could quite name, but everyone could feel. Karoline Leavitt sat quietly at her podium, her face unreadable. Jeff Bezos leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers clasped tightly in front of his face. He was no longer the commanding mogul who walked onto the stage with quiet confidence. His armor had cracked just a little, but enough for the world to see. The host, Brian Ward, gave a forced smile as the countdown for the segment ended. "Welcome back to National Spotlight." What began as a conversation on business and public policy has shifted into a national reckoning over transparency and influence. We now turn to our guests for final remarks. Ms. Leavitt, you may begin. Karoline stood slowly, gathering the sealed folder again, but keeping it closed. She didn't glance at Bezos. She didn't need to. "My job," she began, "isn't to attack billionaires. I'm not here to argue with the success of any one company. Amazon created jobs. Yes. It pushed technology forward. But what's being missed in this conversation is what happens when the system bends for some and breaks for everyone else." The audience was silent. There are documents, photographs, communications that raise legitimate questions. Why was a private equity firm owned by Ms. Sanchez granted direct lines to logistics contracts tied to pandemic recovery? Why did that firm double its valuation weeks after a closed-door meeting involving federal supply officers and private aviation reps? She paused, let the silence expand, then continued. "The American people deserve answers. And those answers will come not tonight, but soon, through the proper channels, through oversight. But make no mistake," she said, finally locking eyes with Bezos. "This conversation is not over." Then she sat. Brian turned. "Mr. Bezos." Jeff didn't. Rise's voice, when it came, was lower, rougher than before. You know, I built everything I have from scratch. I didn't start with a trust fund. I started with a borrowed office and second-hand servers. Now you want to turn that into something sinister. No one spoke. You can scrutinize the contracts, audit the meetings. I have nothing to hide. But this, he motioned to the screen behind him, where the tarmac image still lingered. This is not journalism. This is political theater. I've met presidents, prime ministers, royal families. You don't survive that world by hiding in shadows. He stood now, calmer but unyielding. But I get it. This is about control. Who tells the story? Who wins? The narrative? And if this government thinks it can control people like me by threatening reputations, it's going to find out just how fast a private citizen can fight back. Karoline didn't respond. Didn't even blink. Brian tried to wrap up. We've clearly touched a nerve across the country tonight. For better or worse, transparency is now the central demand. We thank our guests, Ms. Leavitt and Mr. Bezos, for what has been undeniably unforgettable conversation. The cameras panned out. Applause was scattered, cautious, almost as if the audience was unsure how to react. The music played quietly under the credits, but the energy in the studio didn't settle. It hovered thick, unstable. Backstage, Karoline walked calmly down the corridor, followed by her aide, who handed her a phone. "It's Sarah Mitchell," the aide whispered. "She wants to go on record. She's ready." Karoline nodded slowly. "Good. Have her meet me at the Capitol office tomorrow. Bring the USB drive." Meanwhile, in a black SUV outside the studio, Bezos sat silently. His driver didn't speak. His phone buzzed twice. Private message, she knows. Do not reply. He stared at it, then looked out the window. The city lights blurred past, like questions with no clear answer. The story, it seemed, had only just begun. Karoline Leavitt's office in D.C. was usually calm at this hour, but tonight it buzzed like a war room. Aides paced with files in hand. Televisions flickered with news coverage of the Bezos confrontation. And the red phone on her desk, a secure line, rarely used, blinked quietly. Sarah Mitchell, the investigative journalist who had tipped Karoline off days earlier, stood near the window, clutching her bag like it contained explosives. In a way, it did. Karoline entered briskly, her suit still crisp from the broadcast, her demeanor cool but alert. She didn't offer greetings. "Did you bring it?" Sarah nodded and placed the USB on the table. Karoline gestured toward her tech. Analyst Ethan Kola, former intelligence contractor, now part of her inner circle. He plugged it into a secure laptop. The screen came alive. "Same data we reviewed last week." Karoline asked. Sarah shook her head. "It's deeper. The earlier leaks were surface. What you saw was a tease. What's in this drive? Includes audio, voice memos, and back-end email metadata. Some of it comes from Bezos's own archived comes retrieved during a server refresh in his private aerospace firm." Karoline narrowed her eyes. "How the hell did you get that?" Sarah hesitated. "A whistleblower. Used to work cybersecurity at Blue Origin. They noticed flags during an unrelated server probe. These files weren't deleted properly." The room went quiet. Ethan clicked through encrypted folders. One was labeled LS 1221's meeting log. Karoline stepped closer. "LS, as in Lauren Sánchez." Sarah nodded. "That's what the whistleblower believes. Look at this." Ethan opened an audio file. A scratchy voice female, confident, came through the speakers. "Jeff said they're stalling again on the Port Authority. I told him the only way around it is to remind them we hold the drone contract. If Karoline keeps pushing, go silent. Let her show her cards first." Karoline's jaw tightened. "That was a phone recording?" she asked. Encrypted voice message cross-referenced. "It's real." Another voice followed in the next clip mail. "God, but direct. We can move the files from the London account. Keep it labeled as logistics R&D. No one will trace it through the shell fund unless someone's really digging. Karoline turned to Ethan. Can we confirm this came from Bezos's firm? Ethan nodded. Digital trail matches. It's not fabricated. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sarah whispered, "Are you really going public with this?" Karoline looked out the window at the Capitol dome glowing in the distance. Her voice was steady. If the system is being bent behind closed doors, if contracts, data, and influence are being weaponized under personal relationships, we don't have a choice. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about integrity. Her aide entered, holding a folder. Karoline, breaking news, Bezos's legal team just filed a formal complaint. They're accusing you of spreading coordinated defamation and demand an investigation. Karoline didn't flinch. Let them dig. The deeper they go, the worse it'll get for them. She turned back to Ethan. Create a secure backup. Have one copy sent to the Senate Oversight Committee under sealed submission. Ethan blinked. Under your name? Karoline hesitated. No, anonymous drop. Let them investigate it without political fingerprints. Outside the office, the city stirred with headlines. News tickers now read, Levy-Bezos clash raises questions of private influence in public contracts. Sánchez named in leaked corporate memos. DOJ monitoring developments. Senate sources confirm new files submitted to oversight. Counsel source unknown. Karoline sat down, finally exhaling. This wasn't over. It wasn't even close. She knew tomorrow cameras would swarm, statements would be demanded, allies would scatter, enemies would circle. But for now, the truth was moving, and momentum was on her side. Down the street, in a tall apartment high above D.C., Jeff Bezos poured himself a drink, alone, watching the chaos unfold on muted screens. His phone, vibrated, got a text message from an unknown number. You should have kept her name out of your mouth. He deleted it instantly, but the tension didn't leave. Because for the first time in years, Bezos wasn't sure who held more power, him or the woman now leading the most dangerous truth campaign in Washington. The morning sun rose over Washington, D.C., but the city didn't wake slowly. It jolted to life like a machine rebooting under pressure. Headlines flooded every platform. News anchors repeated Karoline Leavitt's name with urgency usually reserved for national emergencies. Inside the Capitol, chaos brewed. Senators whispered in hallways, aides moved with hurried steps, and reporters camped outside committee chambers. A hearing had been called unexpected, unscheduled, but unavoidable. The Oversight Committee had received the anonymous drop overnight, and they were taking it seriously. KarolineLeavitt.com and Prepared walked past the cameras without flinching. Flanked by her legal advisor and Ethan Cole, she didn't say a word. Her silence only added to the drama. Inside the hearing room, the committee's mood was fractured. Some members were visibly angry at the leaks, at the media attention, at the fact that they had been forced into this position. Others looked intrigued, almost excited, as if they sensed a crack in the glass that had covered powerful players for too long. The chairman tapped the mic. We are here under urgent circumstances following the submission of materials that allege misconduct related to federal contracts, offshore holdings, and improper influence involving private corporate executives and public figures. We will hear from all relevant parties. Ms. Leavitt, you may begin. Karoline stood. No speechwriter, no notes. Just her. I didn't come here today to accuse a billionaire. I came here to defend the truth. I came here because powerful people are playing two games, one in public and one in the shadows. And I refuse to let that second game continue unchecked. She paused, letting the tension build. The documents you received weren't collected by me. They were brought forward by individuals who couldn't watch from the sidelines anymore. They contain encrypted voice messages, metadata from private communications, financial tracking logs, and written exchanges implicating key actors in contract manipulation. One senator interrupted. Are you saying Jeff Bezos and his partner knowingly influenced federal logistics and tech contracts for personal or political gain? Karoline met his eyes. I'm saying you'll find evidence that points exactly in that direction and that if we don't ask those questions now, we'll be complicit. In a sudden shift, the doors at the back of the chamber opened. Jeff Bezos entered. He wasn't smiling. His legal team surrounded him like a wall, but he walked ahead of them, taking a seat at the opposing table. He requested the mic. I did not come here to be slandered. I came because my name is being dragged through a political circus. Ms. Leavitt is a skilled communicator, but what she's doing isn't whistleblowing, it's grandstanding. These documents unverified. That voice on the recording confirmed. These allegations, carefully timed to damage reputation, not uncover truth. The room buzzed. Committee members leaned forward. The senator asked, then will you consent to a full forensic review of your firm's internal communications? Jeff Bezos hesitated. On the advice of counsel, I cannot consent to unrestricted access. Karoline didn't even need to speak. The refusal said enough. But then, from behind the scenes, the unexpected happened. Sarah Mitchell, the journalist, stood up from the gallery. She wasn't scheduled to speak, but she raised a single item. In her hand, a notarized chain of custody report from the whistleblower. The source is willing to testify, she said. And this, she held up a flash drive, contains the encryption key. The committee exploded. Cameras turned. To catch every angle, senators demanded immediate recess to verify the new submission. Karoline stood quietly, her face unreadable. Bezos sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, knowing something had shifted, something permanent. An hour later, the chairman returned, his face pale but composed. The committee has verified that the encryption matches the whistleblower materials, and as such, we are opening an official inquiry into the financial conduct of all parties mentioned. Gasps filled the room. Bezos's legal team rose instantly, whispering frantically. Bezos just stared ahead. Karoline slowly gathered her folder and walked out. No victory speech, no smile. Just resolve. Outside, the press surged. Ms. Leavitt. What happens now? She paused, turning just enough to be heard. Now the truth gets to breathe. That night, every channel covered the hearing. Editorials raged. Some called her reckless. Others called her a hero. But one thing was clear: Karoline Leavitt had changed the game. In the dark corner of a corporate penthouse, Lauren Sánchez watched the footage with crossed arms. Her phone buzzed. A message from a private number. This is only the beginning. And somewhere in D.C., another file was being prepared. Because power doesn't vanish overnight. But sometimes it cracks. Just enough to let justice in.